It's my pleasure to introduce you to Johann Unger this morning. Just a little bit of background about Johnny and how this all fits together with what you've been doing and where you might be going with this. Johnny is a lecturer and academic director in Dell, which is within FAS, which is the Department of English Language and Literacy. His focus in terms of his research has been on areas of language and multilingualism, but also on areas of social media, which from our point of view is particularly interesting. And the methodological approaches that he's taken is in the area of critical discourse study and critical discourse analysis, which I think is an area that you may not have had any in-depth look at, but I think is certainly worth looking at from the point of view of what's happening in technology, which may very well apply to studies that you want to do. So I'm delighted that Johnny was willing to come along this morning and to share his thoughts about critical discourse analysis and how he's been using that within studies on social media. Without more ado, we look forward to your discussion, Johnny.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And now normally when I talk to groups of colleagues, researchers, PhD students, master's students, undergraduates, regardless of what sort of stage in their academic careers, the groups of people I'm talking to tend to know more about linguistics and about discourse studies than they do about social media. And I think in this particular group, it's the other way around, from what Don said and from what I gather. So I will talk a bit about social media because I think it's important to think about why somebody who's doing critical discourse research might be interested in social media. But I also want to talk a bit about critical discourse studies more in general, before then going on to look more specifically at how this has been applied to social media by different people in the past and what is happening at present. So if at any point during the talk something isn't clear, then just feel free to put up your hand and ask. And I may just say I'll come to that later. But if it's something that I think would be helpful to go into, I'll do that. That also means I'm not exactly sure about the timing. I do aim to leave some time at the end for discussion of a few questions that I think are interesting. But also we may get sidetracked during and discuss some of the things that I've been talking about or that you bring in. And also I'll be asking you some questions. Now, because of the size of the group, I'll probably ask you to discuss things with your neighbors in the first instance. But then I might also ask for volunteers to summarize some of the things that you've been saying to the people next to you. So please do be forthcoming when I ask you to do that, because I think that really also improves this kind of session so that it's not just me talking for 90 minutes. Okay, so just to begin with, who has heard of critical discourse analysis before today, or critical discourse studies? Okay, a few people. Who would say that they've read a number of works in this area in pursuit of their studies? Okay, all right. All right, so that's really useful to know. So I think what I'll do first of all is I've brought along a handout which summarizes some of the sort of key principles of critical discourse studies. And I'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes just talking about that and going through some of these with you. Yeah, Don, if you could just pass those along, that would be great. So I'll give you an overview. Then I'll move on to talking about why people who do this kind of research might be interested in social media. And I'll probably go through that rather more quickly because, as I said, I assume that there's a fair bit of knowledge in the room. Probably some of you know much more about social media than I do. Then I'll go on to talk about some of the work that's been done so far, but also bring in other approaches from linguistics and related disciplines that you might find useful when you're thinking about social media in your particular areas. And finally, as I said, if we get time, we'll move on to talk about some discussion. We'll move on to talk about some interesting issues in this area. Okay, so the handout that you've got in front of you, please don't attempt to read it all just at the moment, but this really is for you to take away with you and to refer to as we go along. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of some of the principal assumptions, which is number 1 on your handout. And I think there's a few important things to understand. First of all, there's quite a lot of confusion about critical discourse analysis, critical discourse studies, discourse studies. Should we call it critical or not? And this is an ongoing area of debate within the field. But generally, what has happened over the past 25 years is that people started off talking about critical discourse analysis, and in the last 5 years or so, people have moved more to talking about discourse studies and critical discourse studies. So one of the most popular textbooks in the field, which is Methods of Critical Discourse Analysis, in its most recent edition last year, actually changed its name to Methods of Critical Discourse Studies. So that's an indication of the move. And I think one of the reasons for this is also important for you to realize, which is that it's not really a methodology. Okay, so I'd like to be able to say, here are all the steps you need to do critical discourse studies, but actually it's a much more broad approach or orientation to research. And this is, I'm sure, something you've come across with regard to other approaches. For example, something like ethnography might have particular methods which are associated with it, but more generally is an orientation to research which could involve quite a lot of different methods. And that's true for critical discourse studies as well. So the other thing that's confusing is that, as I mentioned, this textbook, it's actually called Methods of Critical Discourse Studies now. But what it contains is actually more a set of approaches within critical discourse studies, which also are quite eclectic in terms of methodology. All right? So having sowed some confusion, I'm going to try and narrow it down a little bit and talk about one specific approach within critical discourse studies, which is the discourse historical approach. I'll come on to that in a minute. And this is the approach that I've mainly worked within and which I've used to look at different areas of society. My earlier work was on language policy, and that intersected quite a bit with education, actually, because I was interested in how a particular language in Scotland, the Scots language, is constructed in people's talk and in official policy documents. And part of that involved looking at educational curricula and guidelines. But more recently, I've worked on social media, and I found that the discourse historical approach and the principles underlying it have actually allowed me to explore social media in ways that I find very interesting. And even though it wasn't developed with social media in mind, there's actually quite a lot of overlaps and synergies with other approaches to social media. So we'll come on to that in a bit. Let me just quickly fly through some of these principal assumptions, and you'll recognize some of these from other approaches as well, more broadly in social science and humanities. So they're not unique. The first is that there's this link between discourse and society. So discourse, the language that we use, the texts that we use, the images that we use to communicate for a particular social purpose. And as a result, there is a link with society, with culture, and they're mutually constitutive. So discourse shapes society, society shapes discourse. You can't really have one without the other. Societies are based on communication and on communicating meaning with other people, and in so doing, you actually shape the society that you're in. So language then is viewed as a social practice. Now, there are a number of other practice-based approaches which I think are very common in educational research. So this presumably isn't particularly new to you, but thinking about language and the role of language in this is the focus of discourse studies. Now, the second assumption is that it's worth looking at texts. So other linguists might look at tiny fragments of language, phonemes or morphemes, so the very basic building blocks of language. And within linguistics, it's a very broad church, if you will. It goes right up to sort of whole texts. And that's one of the principles, is that it is worth looking at texts because they are sites of discursive practice. So they are places where discourse happens and where things are done with language. And of course, texts don't stand in isolation. They're part of contexts. And if you look at number 3 on your handout, there's an overview of how context is understood in one particular version of discourse studies, the discourse historical approach. And here there are 4 levels. There's the context that is immediately around the text. So if you're looking at a newspaper article, what is on the page around it? What other articles are there? What ads are there? What's the design like? And various other things. Then there's the relationship between other texts. So a newspaper article might reference a politician's speech or a press release or something else. And in turn, people on a media program might talk about this newspaper article and so on. So texts are related to each other, and this also forms part of the context. And then, of course, you have institutions which shape texts and within which texts are also consumed. So there's media organizations. If a newspaper article is about schools and educational policy, as many newspaper articles are at the moment in the UK, then, of course, educational institutions might come into it as well. So these different institutional contexts also shape texts and are shaped by texts. And then you have the broadest level of context, which is sort of the political, social, cultural context. And all of these are interesting and relevant. Of course, we can't necessarily study all of these all in one go, but it's worth thinking about them when we're doing an analysis. So we can't just say, this happened in politics, therefore this newspaper article looks like this. But we can look at patterns over time, and we can look at, for example, in research into migration, we can look at the way that politicians talk about migrants and the language that is used in newspapers to talk about migrants, and we can think about the links that may exist between the two and how they might shape each other and how this might change over time. Okay, so the next point is about ideologies. So these can be defined as coherent and relatively stable sets of beliefs or values, and these are formed partly through production and reproduction in texts. So I mentioned migration just now. That's a very nice example, because if we think about how the media talks about migrants in the UK and in other countries, we can see particular ideologies such as migrants being a nuisance. Now, I don't agree with that, of course, but if I were to buy certain newspapers, I would find this ideology repeated in many different ways, some of them subtle, some of them not so subtle. Okay? And of course, once a particular ideology becomes established, then it can become quite difficult to actually step outside this. So debates in society become framed in particular ways, which are inherently ideological. And it can then be quite difficult to think outside these ideologies. And what you get when you have this kind of system is a hegemony. Have you come across this term before? Yeah, okay, so that's something that's common in other disciplines as well. It's also important in discourse studies. Now finally, and this again is common with some approaches in education research, in sociology, in discourse studies, actually not quite finally, but almost finally, in discourse studies, we start with a social wrong. So we say, there's something wrong here. What can I as a researcher do about it? Okay, so there are other approaches like action research, various critical approaches within education that have a similar starting point. Now, you don't necessarily have to start by identifying a social wrong, but if you want to situate yourself within critical discourse studies, at some point in your research, that is something that you should talk about, even if that isn't how you came to it. So you might have come to it by thinking, oh, there's something interesting about this particular situation. And then you investigate it further, and then you realize, Actually, the reason this attracted my interest is because there is very clearly a power imbalance here, and this is something that I want to talk about more. Okay, so there's no one entry point, but at some point within your research, if you consider yourself to be doing critical discourse research, that is something that will become important. And then finally, discourse studies is not a positivistic, experimental approach where you can put people in a lab and say, I know everything that you think about migration now, but rather it's very much an approach that looks at the whole context and thinks about how social phenomena are shaped by the language people use, and also how this changes over time. So it's not always possible to come up with a hypothesis, for example, in discourse research. And when my students, undergraduates and master's students, go to research methods classes, and they come and they say, okay, so what's my hypothesis here? And I say, is that really a concept that's useful here? Because you're not doing experimental research. You're not doing positivistic research. So again, that's something that's common with other approaches. All right, then just very briefly, I mentioned that I talk about discourse historical analysis as one particular approach, and there are others too. Here are the steps that you can take to do a discourse historical analysis, and you'll see how these link with the points I made earlier on about the general principles. The first is to sample information. So you find out more about your context, you find out more about the particular texts or language that you're interested in came into being at different levels of context. Once you've found out more about them, and you might particularly think about genre at this point. So genre here means, I suppose, the type of text you're dealing with. And that isn't restricted to sort of, you've probably, if you haven't come across genre in social science research, you're probably familiar with the idea of genre in literature. So you have detective fiction, you have literary fiction, etc., romance. So that's a useful starting point for understanding genre. But in discourse studies, genre is more to do with the type of text that you're dealing with and the function of that text. So something like a press release, something like an educational curriculum would be example of written genres, but you also have spoken genres like a lecture, like an interaction between a teacher and a student, like a discussion in an online forum. So these could all be considered genres as well. So you find out more about that. And at that point, you might try to sample more ethnographic information by actually looking at the context in which this text or genre appears and getting involved in it yourself. Now, this, of course, can throw up some ethical issues, particularly when you're dealing with digital media, with social media. So that's something where you first need to think about, can I actually do this research ethically? And maybe we'll have a bit of time to talk about that later on as well. But assuming you can do it ethically, you get more information, for example, through ethnographic methods, and you think about what other texts resemble this text and how they might relate to it, and what other texts draw on this text or what other texts are used within this text to shape it, to contribute to it. And examples there are texts with similar arguments, so thinking about migration again, who else is talking about migrants as a nuisance, and who is countering this? Yeah, who is actually saying how positive migrants are for society? Macro topics, which are sort of what a text is about. And then fields of action, that's things like politics, education, etc., and genres, which I've already mentioned. Okay, so then with your problem in mind, so your social wrong that you have taken possibly as your starting point or that you've discovered in looking at a particular context, you then come up with research questions, and then you think about not just your own narrow disciplinary focus, but you think about what other academic disciplines might have said about this topic. And that's very important for discourse studies. It is interdisciplinary. So if I want to look at education, then I go and read research in education and in sociology and in technology studies and in other studies that are relevant to the topic, not just linguistics. Okay, what that does is it allows you to develop explanatory theories that you can apply to your different levels of context. So if I'm thinking about texts in politics, then I want to go off and read political studies because probably people will have done quite a lot of theoretical work in politics, which can help me understand it. Then you turn these research questions. Now, in the case of linguistic research, you'd be thinking about linguistic categories. So the example I mentioned earlier on, how do newspapers talk about migration? I might look at what particular labels are used for migrants and try and study those across a wide range of texts, or look in detail at just a few texts and think about that very carefully. But it doesn't necessarily have to be linguistic in the narrowest sense. So you can think about language more broadly and think about what kinds of language use shape texts. And you apply, so then you start your analysis, your actual analysis, and you actually apply these categories to your text, but you're also thinking about the different theoretical approaches that you've come across, that you've drawn on, that you're drawing on, to actually explain why things are the way they are. So again, to come back to my favorite example of migration, you might look at theoretical research in psychology to explain why people are xenophobic. Or you might look at research in history to look at other instances where there has been discrimination against migrants, and use this to help you interpret what you find in your data. So then you do something which in this particular version is called drawing a context diagram. Okay. Now that just means that you try and represent visually how the different parts of your data fit together. And if you look at studies in discourse research, you'll find lots of these diagrams, including my own work. And sometimes I look back at them a few years later and I think, what did I mean by that? So we're not always very good at making them clear and simple, but it's quite a useful way of helping yourself to understand what it is that you're doing, even if you don't end up putting it in your final work, assignments, publications, etc. And then finally, you continue to interpret, and then you go back to your research questions and think about the problem under investigation. And this is what you might call a process of abductive reasoning. Have you come across the idea of abduction before? Some of you, maybe. So this draws ultimately, I suppose, on the work of Charles Sanders Peirce, who presented this as a way of thinking that got around this dichotomy between induction and deduction. Okay, so deduction, drawing logical inferences based only on the information that you have, the premises that you have. Induction, thinking about observations and predicting what might happen in the future. This is, of course, very sort of simplistic. And abduction involves looking at theoretical understandings of a topic and at data and going back and forth between the two and making comparisons. Okay, so it's kind of between those two modes of thinking and researching. All right, I talked a bit longer than I intended to about this, so I'm going to go back to my Prezi now. All right, so let me ask you then to talk with your neighbors for a little bit about something that, first of all, before we do that, does anyone have any immediate questions of clarification about what I've just said? Yeah.
It's a cotext.
What's a cotext? So cotext is the text that is immediately around the text that you're interested in. So, yeah, in the example I gave earlier on, a newspaper article, it could be all the other articles on the page. It's quite important in social media because there's usually a lot going on screens. And traditionally, researchers have focused just on, I suppose, the textual or interactive elements of social media. So with something like instant messaging, they might focus just on the text of the instant messages. But I'd argue that it's actually important to think about what else is going on. So if you're looking at Facebook as data, for example, you might have a small chat window at the bottom of your screen if you're using Facebook on a web browser, but you have your timeline, you have ads, you have other things going on in the screen. And those could actually be quite important in shaping the interaction. And by just focusing on the text, you're losing that. Okay? Yeah?
When you undergo a study, you give yourself a certain time frame, looking back and forth?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And that depends on your research questions. So are you interested in how things change over time? And it depends on the nature of the data. Now, in social media, things tend to happen very quickly. So if you were working, for example, with Twitter data, you might get hundreds or thousands of tweets just from one day, and it might, in the end, be too much data to deal with, so you might have to narrow your time window. But usually, you look at the context and you think about what important things have happened and how does this relate to my data? And you might then take particular events to help you to select data that is relevant to the problem that you're investigating. Okay? Yeah?
Since you say this is an approach, does that actually offer you an opportunity to do a theoretical framework through the studies, or is it something outside of a discourse? This study approach?
Yes, I mean, there definitely are some theoretical assumptions, but it depends on which particular area you're looking at. So there are theoretical assumptions about discourse, like the ones that you've got in number 1. But then if you were looking at, say, political language, you would bring in theoretical assumptions about politics. If you're looking at educational settings, you'll bring in theories about education. So it's kind of not a single theoretical framework, but one that you assemble based on the problem that you're investigating. Okay, we'll have one more question. I think we had one over here.
Well, I just was interested because you said social media, and that the social media opens input or brings in input from various different contexts, and you said context is very important here. So how do you differentiate between somebody's text that is from a society A and then joining in from society A, B, C, D, or whatever, so many others? How do you use that data?
Okay, that's actually a question that really interests me as well, and I don't have a straightforward answer to it, but I would say that it isn't useful to think about societies as monolithic, as one society which has a unified set of cultural assumptions. So I certainly think you can make some generalizations. For example, which languages are typically used in a particular society. But I think beyond that, often there are far greater differences within societies than between them. And so it probably makes more sense to think about things like communities of practice, which is a concept you might have come across as well. For particular contexts, there will be communities of practice which may come from very different countries and different parts of the world geographically, but will nevertheless be united by a particular task, such as an interest in beekeeping, let's say, and that will shape their interactions. But of course, what is happening outside social media will also shape their interactions. So it's kind of, you have to think about it, I think, in a more dynamic way than saying society A, society B, but rather within this social media landscape, which has access from different parts of the world, people of different ages, people with different educational backgrounds, people of different classes, people of different, gender, etc. Within this quite potentially diverse community, what particular communities are formed and how homogeneous are they, how heterogeneous are they? So I think you can ask questions about that, and that's part of your investigation. I don't know if that answers your question, but generally I'd say you have to think fluidly and you have to look at your data, and this is why you need some kind of ethnographic insights for a lot of this kind of research, because otherwise you can't understand the kinds of questions that you asked. Okay? All right. So we started talking a bit about social media. I think what might be useful is if you just very briefly talk with your neighbors and come up with a one-sentence definition of social media that applies in your particular professional contexts or in the research context that you've been thinking about during this program. So if you take about 60 seconds maximum to define social media with your neighbors. Easy task, right? All right, let's bring it together again. Don't worry, you'll have more time for discussion. Did anyone come up with a particularly concise and pithy definition of social media that they're willing to share with the class? Okay, that's it. Can you please shop in your neighbors and tell us if they did?
Communities of practice, certainly the plural is an emphasis, that transcend physical borders, cultural barriers, and a few other things that we were still talking about. But the transcending bit was probably important.
I like that. Transcendence. Okay. Anyone have a different sort of definition? There's no right or wrong answer to this. Yeah?
Communication at light speed.
Communication at light speed. Okay. Interesting idea. So we're thinking about the speed of the communication. Yeah?
I mean, to me, social media is the Web2 technologies that allow people to both connect with each other and produce content.
Okay.
Without no technical knowledge.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think that's very important, this idea of production, and I'll talk about that some more. All right. Any other definitions which bring in something new that we haven't heard yet?
Yeah, it's a sort of platform through which people share content, share ideas, and exchange views.
Okay, fantastic. So I think between those four different ideas, we've really got a core of a definition that's quite broad and that allows us to think about social media. Now, you'll see that this is one definition which my colleague Majid Khosravinik, who's at Newcastle University, and I have put in a publication. And this is more the sort of platform-based definition, so the idea that it is a particular instance of technology, but there is a focus on communication as well, and the way communication happens. And we've got examples there of different kinds of communication, one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, etc. I'm sure this all isn't new to you. And also the idea that you can have different sorts of social media communication within a single platform, like Facebook, whereas others may be much more narrowly focused on just one kind of communication, like WhatsApp or email. And the other thing is that we mentioned Web 2, which is a term that I don't particularly like because
But it's probably now it's different.
Well, it's more that it has an origin in the sort of commercial background to the web, and it's really, I suppose, a term that I associate with marketing. But it is widely used, so I think it's useful to know. The term that I use is the participatory internet, and it's important to realize that it's not just the web as well. So text messaging or SMS is still a very, very widely used form of communication, which doesn't run via the internet, although these days it often does actually, because phone companies use the internet to send packages of information. But it doesn't run via the web, certainly, and nor do services like WhatsApp or email.
Actually, why didn't you put also many-to-many here in the kind of interaction, communication between individuals or groups?
Yeah, can you give an example of a many-to-many?
Yes, many-to-many, it can be between two groups who are using Skype, for example, and they are together,
So
one group.
Two groups that are Skyping?
Yes.
Okay, so something like a conference call. Yeah, okay, that's a good example. We'll add that to the next edition. Thank you.
One to don't know who.
One to don't know who. Okay, can you give an example of that?
I put a post on a blog and I don't know who's going to read it.
Okay.
What they're going to make of it.
I would probably call that still one to many, but you're quite right that you don't necessarily know who the audience is in web communication.
They could use it, or they could nick the idea, or and not cite me or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit skeptical.
Does this worry you?
Oh,
It's not that I'm not. Since 2007 to 12, 5 years of blogging, being on social media, now I can say very proudly that I'm quite tired, but I'm not going to use it.
Okay.
Because I've burned my hands quite a lot.
You've become cynical.
I have.
Disillusioned. Okay. All right. Well, actually, I think a certain level of cynicism is very important when you're thinking about social media. And I'll say a bit more about that. I'll say a bit more about that now, actually. So there's been some, I think, very interesting research on social media that has come from linguistics mainly, but also from sociology and politics and other approaches. And one of the things that people think about within other fields, more than within linguistics, is that social media has become, I think, ubiquitous. So it's everywhere, and it's very hard to avoid. And even if you are disillusioned and you decide, I'm not going to do this, actually, social media will still affect your lives in different ways. Now, a very simple example, I have some friends who don't go on Facebook. Shocking, I know. And they still sometimes are affected by Facebook because other friends organize social events via Facebook. Now, whether somebody remembers to invite that friend via some other medium or not may depend on, whether anyone remembers or not. But that event has still been organized by Facebook. People have shaped it. People have discussed it. People have said, oh, I'll bring a salad. I'll bring chips. The person who isn't there is still affected when they go to this event, which has been shaped by social media. So a very simple example. You could think of lots of others with other social media platforms. Crispin Thurlow is one colleague whose work is quite entertaining in this. And he gave a talk, and he's written about this as well, about how he was having breakfast one day, and he saw that on his milk carton it said, "Follow me on Twitter." And he said, why would I follow my milk on Twitter, And I don't want my milk to follow me either. So he's quite skeptical about this, which I can understand. And this is an example of a church sign in Toronto when I was there a couple of years ago, last year. So follow us on Twitter at St. Andrews TO, Toronto. So your church, in this case, you can follow on Twitter as well. And you can find lots of examples of this. But I think the point is, social media is very widespread. It's difficult to avoid. But also, although you can be skeptical about this and you can worry about it, people do find it very useful as well. For example, if you want to find out whether your train is delayed, you can often get an answer much more quickly on Twitter than you can by going to the station and looking on the notice board. Traffic, weather, disasters, you can think of lots of examples. So many people sort of waver between this kind of cynical, skeptical view and actually finding it very useful in different contexts. And of course, I don't need to tell you about how students in different contexts use social media very frequently and very widely, and sometimes in very useful and productive ways, maybe other times in very distracting ways. Okay. The second thing to think about is this idea of production of texts, which you mentioned, which is very important. Now, this concept that I've got on the slide here, prosumption, which is a combination of production and consumption, is the idea that people produce texts which are then consumed by the same group of people. So an example of this is reviews of restaurants and hotels on sites like TripAdvisor, which are written by the people who stay in those hotels or eat at those restaurants, and who then post reviews, and who might read reviews. And it can often lead to some very curious things, like Subway being named as the best restaurant in a particular city, just because a certain number of people happen to really like Subway. But I think the more general point is that all of this work is being done for free. Okay, so Christian Fuchs, who I think is a very interesting scholar when it comes to social media, his book, A Social Media, A Critical Introduction is a really good, for me, analysis of some of these wider issues in society connected to social media. He calls it digital labor. Now, this work is being done for free by people who say, great, I can get reviews and I enjoy posting reviews. But of course, there are also companies behind this that actually profit from this by showing their ads to the people who are using these sites. And this is something that people often lose sight of when they're doing research into social media. So they look at the kind of the details of the language that's used. They might look at multimodally at how sites are constructed, but they don't always think, okay, but who is actually benefiting from this? Who is shaping this? How do the technologies influence what people do? But also, who benefits from having developed these technologies and all these people who provide their work for free? And that is something that I think should be a key question for critical discourse scholars. Yes?
Yes, the citation at the bottom is from 2010, and that is 6 years ago, and that's a very long time in terms of social media technology. Does that give you any concerns from a trustworthiness point of view? Do you think the knowledge in that paper is still sufficiently trustworthy, given that it's 6 years ago?
That's a good question. I would say it's actually very much ahead of its time. If you think this was published in 2010, probably the research that connects to it was done 2008, 2009 at the latest, when social media was really only starting to become ubiquitous. And yet they recognized something which I think has become far more widespread and far more important to understand. But you can find other more recent research as well, which corroborates that and makes the same point. But I think that's a good question. You know, when you're dealing with social media research, and something I'll say a little bit later on as well, people tend to chase after technologies. So they say, ooh, let's look at Flickr, let's look at Snapchat, let's look at Yik Yak or whatever the latest platform is. And they lose sight of the idea that actually, although these platforms may have different names, they're drawing on often the same sorts of practices, and there's incremental development. And even sites like Twitter, which seem to have been very, very transformative, and the buzzword that's used in the industry is disruptive. You can find continuities with earlier platforms, and more recent platforms, you can find continuities to those as well. So I think it's worth not thinking of it as a snapshot, but thinking about the development over time. Okay, and then I mentioned earlier on this idea of people being skeptical versus people finding things useful. And this is reflected in the research as well. You have people who you might describe as cyber utopians. Isn't social media great? It's going to transform society. It's going to bring democracy to this place or that place. On the other hand, you also have moral panics. For example, who here has read or heard somebody say that social media are ruining language? Not that you believe it yourself, but who's heard it? Pretty much everyone, okay? And who has heard that Twitter is responsible for the revolutions in North Africa and the Middle East, the Arab Springs? Who's heard somebody say that or read it? Okay, almost everyone. So I think those are two extreme examples of these two views. And this is something that's actually reflected in research as well. So research into this often takes these stances. And it's important, I think, to take a step back and say, is it actually something that either is going to ruin society and is terrible, or something that is going to transform society and is wonderful? Or is it actually something that is in between? Okay. Right. All right. I think I won't spend too much time talking about this because this is connected to media, and you may or may not be interested in this. But I would just say generally on this that social media, sometimes the influence of social media on traditional media has been overstated, certainly within the media themselves, but also within research. But I think this quote at the end, pretty much makes that point. New and mobile news practices like linking, sharing, liking, recommending, commenting, and voting have not become as central to news consumption as is often assumed, but they have had a role in them. Okay? And this is something that's particularly changing, I think, right now with, for example, the Independent newspaper in the UK ceasing its print edition, and there's lots of other examples of this. Things are changing. And this picture I've got here is one that I saw on my TV screen on the news a few months ago, which was a report on a car accident where a car sort of drove into a hole that had opened up because of floods. And on the news screen, it had a picture of somebody flipping through pictures of this car crash on their phone. And I just thought this was very interesting. So traditional breakfast news program showing somebody consuming this particular crash on their phone as a way of making the visual reportage more interesting. And then, of course, also in some news programs, you have things like tweet us or send us a message, what's happening in your area, what do you think about this, if you've been affected by this, etc. So social media brought into traditional news media in various ways. But that's all I'll say about that for now. A lot of what I've just been talking about, and some of the things you raised earlier on as well in your questions and points, is reflected in this diagram, which is also from this 2015 chapter that I mentioned before. This is in the book Methods of Critical Discourse Studies, by the way, in the 2015 edition. So this is kind of a combination of the understandings of context that I talked about earlier on, and the specifics of social media as a social phenomenon. So we have the sort of broadest socio-political context here, which kind of brackets everything. And then within that, we have specific media contexts and genre-specific contexts, such as how a particular institution is designed, how it links with the corporate world, as I was saying earlier on, who actually benefits from people writing reviews on a site like TripAdvisor. How does it fit into things like government surveillance? So Facebook, WhatsApp, not WhatsApp anymore because they've just implemented end-to-end encryption, which means that the government can no longer read your WhatsApp messages. Great, they will no longer know what I want for breakfast. Which is fantastic, except they'll probably find a way of finding out. But these kinds of questions might come into this mid-level context where you're thinking about social media as an institution. And then, so you have the social media institution, and this also has links to different social institutions, such as companies, such as political institutions like governments, parliaments, various sort of local levels of government, etc., and other social institutions like schools and universities. And at the other end, you have this link with the processes of production consumption. So how do people actually use social media?
Yes, building on what you've been discussing, when you get to this point, isn't it clear of how social media is transformative? Because when you get to this level, I don't want to get too much into politics, but the election in the United States and how media is there and how reportage on the election can be so opinionated, you know, when the newscasters are talking of we want this and we want this, but then when you go to social media, you have, you know, these networks of conversations happening where when you look at those conversations, you have proof of corporate affiliation, political stance from a historical point of view, something someone may have said 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Social institutions, you have those real discussions, those multimodal discussions happening, and it's very different from what's reported in the news.
Okay.
So there is, I think, a transformative component there.
All right.
A very clear transformative.
Let me play devil's advocate there. You're saying it's very different from what's happening in the news. Would you say that what's happening in the news today is similar to what was happening in the news in, say, 2000? in terms of the level of opinionated reportage, the sort of the partisanship of the media, etc.
In my own opinion, I think the news is very similar to what it was.
Right.
But the social conversations have taken it a lot further than that type of thing.
I think what I'm trying to suggest there is the slide I showed earlier, which suggested that actually there wasn't as much influence on the traditional media as is generally assumed, applies in that case too. You know, I'm not saying there's no influence, but the traditional media are still doing more or less what traditional media do. There may be some overlap where ideas kind of come from social media and then are picked up by traditional media. What's happening in social media, I agree, is something that obviously didn't exist in the same form before social media. But I would argue that it did exist in some forms, for example, in face-to-face conversations. So if you went into a bar or a pub in the UK before social media existed, you would hear people having these same kinds of conversations, not using memes and links and things like that, but using their voices and using gestures. Now, I'm not saying they're the same, okay, but I do think there is a continuity there where you did have informal conversations which brought in different sorts of linguistic and communicative resources than you had at present, but they still happened. And this is also, I mentioned the Arab Springs earlier on. This idea that social media caused the Arab Springs, I think, is a bit ridiculous in many ways. And there's been some interesting research on this which looked at the decisions people made to take part in protests in Egypt and why they took part in them. And social media played a fairly small part. But what also played a part was people talking to their neighbors, people phoning each other, people putting signs in their windows, and various other non-digital forms of communication. So there are continuities there. So I think it is transformative in some ways, but maybe not in terms of the presence of this form of communication at all, but more in terms of how quickly it happens and how geographically distributed it is.
Yeah. Just sort of linking back to this and also something else you said earlier, which is that the ways in which very different types of social media actually end up almost cohering. So people use them very much in the same way. Do you not feel somewhat, when you're looking at social media, that again, you're not really looking at anything different, it's just a different way of mediating these conversations?
Agreed. And my favorite example there draws on some research that one of my colleagues in linguistics does, which looks at Edwardian postcards. That's Julia Gillan, who you might have come across as well. And she's shown, I think very nicely, how closely postcards in this era resemble Twitter, because you had a postal service which allowed up to 4 back and forths a day, and people would write to their families who were maybe staying, if they lived in Manchester, they were staying in Blackpool at the beach, and they would write to them back and forth 4 times a day, writing very short, focused messages, which actually resemble tweets in terms of character count, in terms of use of abbreviations and various other things. It just happened a lot more slowly, 4 a day instead of 4 a minute. But yeah, there are continuities there, definitely.
I think that's all we're actually talking about, is an increase in the speed that we can do all of this. You can go back to people handing out flyers.
I think there are some other differences as well. So increase in speed is definitely important. Increase in geographical spread is important.
Doesn't it also depend who you are and what cultural context you're talking about?
Yes.
I think we should be describing it as if it's homogenous.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm in the Middle East, and I think some of the female students that I teach, their use of social media is to some extent transformative.
Yes.
And they're doing things perhaps that their grandmothers might not have been doing.
Yes. I agree. It does depend on who you are. And also, if you're thinking about, so we were talking about traditional media earlier on, something that's very important to think about is influence. So who actually has influence? And this varies quite widely in social media contexts as well as more broadly in society. What certain people say carries more weight than what other people say, because of things that are to do with their status, with their particular role in society. And so you have people on social media who are very influential and others who are much less influential. And me tweeting something is not going to have the same effect as Stephen Fry tweeting something, because he has millions of followers and I don't. Just purely numerically, but also because of who he is and who I am. Okay? So I think that's a really good point. Yes, half an hour. Okay. All right, so we've, I think unless anyone has any other questions that relate to this, I'll leave this just as a way of representing how these different things fit together. And just the other point I wanted to make about continuities and differences relates to this point. So who benefits financially or politically from people's social media communication? And that's something that you maybe had in much more limited ways in pre-participatory internet contexts. Sure, pubs benefited from people going to the pubs to have conversations because people would buy drinks, but it's a slightly different form of social institution. Okay, right. So I think we've probably talked enough about what's interesting about social media in general. Let's think about, this is basically what we've just been talking about, the idea of continuities and discontinuities. And I think we've covered most of this. The only thing I'd add, from a linguistic perspective, people often talk about how different language is on the internet compared to other forms of writing. And I'd say that is actually often overstated. So for a start, if you think about all the texts on the internet, and I'm focusing here on what I call human-readable text, so not HTML codes and Java and things like that, but actual documents or pages that you might read, they're very, very similar to print. They are government documents, they are press releases, mission statements, guidelines, leaflets, all kinds of things that you also get in print form, and they're produced both for online and physical reading in virtually identical form, except that in one context you'll read them on the screen, and in another context you'll read them on paper. Okay, so that's the first thing to say. And the second thing is that you have many genres which are similar. Now, Susan Herring, whose work I think is very relevant to people who are interested in this area, and I'll come back to it, talks about familiar, reconfigured, and emergent genres. And familiar genres will be things like those that have existed before the participatory web, things like email, text-based chat, etc., which already existed before but still continues. Emergent genres are things that existed before but have been adapted. Reconfigured genres are things that existed before but have been adapted, like review sites, for example, which in the past existed but would have been written by experts, whereas now they're written by lay people, the reviews. Okay? And then emergent genres, which are things that are completely new for the participatory web, and this is things like microblogs, like Twitter. And these, of course, by their very nature, are changing all the time, and there are new ones that we don't know about yet, but the majority of them are still similar to what we had before the participatory web. And so, yeah, again, just to underline this point, that it's usually not a good idea to chase after technologies, but rather to think about practices more broadly. That would be my advice when working in this area. Okay, we've talked quite a bit about the discontinuities. Interactivity is quite an important one, the idea that potentially you can interact with people that you wouldn't have had the chance to interact with in traditional media landscapes. So you can tweet at Jamie Oliver. Whether he'll answer or not is a different question, but in the past, it would have been much more difficult to access these influential, famous people. And the idea that texts in the participatory internet are dynamic. So we have tended to think about text as something fixed in time that we can study, but a text like a Wikipedia article or a forum discussion or comments page linked to a newspaper article actually is changing all the time. And even the article itself may change as it is edited, breaking news changes it, etc. So we have to think about these texts not as fixed and static, but as dynamic. Okay, right. Last time I was giving a lecture on this topic, I had almost no voice at all. So I feel like I'm doing a bit better today, but I have been talking a lot. So let me move on to briefly giving you an overview of some of the work that's been done in critical discourse studies, which I think might be useful for you to look at if you want to work in this area. Now, these are very old studies, and they mainly deal with the pre-participatory internet. So I think that's worth pointing out. But I think they've laid the groundwork for some of the understandings of social media and of digitally mediated data that I draw on. So the first of these is by Ron and Susie Wong Scollin. Have you come across Scollin's work at all? Okay. I think you might find that very interesting. The Scollins basically looked at what they call the emerging internet, and they were particularly interested in email and in online discussion forums. And what they found is that context is absolutely crucial, and that in order to understand how discourse is changing, you need to look at the technologies of discourse as well. So that's this first quote. Any change in the technology of discourse is inherently and necessarily a change in the discourse itself. Now, they understand technologies very broadly, not just as computers or not just as Facebook, but actually things like writing could be considered technology as well. And for me, personally, I would consider voice to be a technology as well. And if you look at the Occupy protests from a few years ago, I was very interested in this concept of the human mic. Have you come across that? So this is the idea, do you want to explain what it is? So you're nodding? Okay. This is the idea that when you have a large group of people outside usually, and no amplification because you're not allowed to or because you might get moved on, then you have one person who says something, and then somebody else further back repeats what you've said, and this spreads through the whole audience this way. So it's quite an interesting way of communicating, and I think it's worth thinking of this as a technology. Not a digital technology, but a technology nevertheless. Yeah, that's a very good question.
In the Islamic world, the pilgrims, when they go to Mecca, this human mic happened for centuries. Really? Because when mic didn't exist, when the lead prayer prayed, there echoes miles after miles for the whole congregation to follow. So it happened for 1,500 years in Mecca.
Was this texts which were just from the Quran, or was it sermons?
It's like, probably all of you experience Muslim praying in a mosque, and there is a lead who recites, and he give commands that now prostrate or whatever.
Yes.
In those days in Mecca, there wasn't any mics, so you created these human mics, wave after wave, and they were actually very much, they designed the whole thing, so they know exactly who's going to do what.
Yes.
So a prostration would have taken about 5 or to 10 minutes, whereas now it takes a few seconds because the mic is there. So it was great.
Oh, thanks for bringing that example. Okay. So to come back to the Scollins, they have this approach which they call nexus analysis, which later on in their later work they call mediated discourse analysis. And this is basically the idea that you have particular nodes, particular nexuses, which are connected to others, and that to study one means that you should study a whole network of practices and of texts. And so this quote here, A nexus analysis entails not only a close empirical examination of the moment under analysis, but also an historical analysis of those trajectories or discourse cycles that intersect in that moment, as well as the anticipations that are opened up by the social actions taken in that moment. So you can see how this is relevant to social media, I think, in that very often things happen at one particular point and then spread and are brought back and are commented on and are recontextualized in different ways. So I find this a very useful way of thinking about the internet. And it also links with work done in literacy studies. So the scholars themselves have been, I'd say, didn't consider themselves to be discourse analysts necessarily, or critical discourse analysts, but they did link a lot with work in literacies. And some of their other work is not about digital texts, but is about educational contexts as well. So that's one study. The second study is by Jay Lemke. It's called Travels in Hypermodality, and this is one of my favorite papers. And so he basically looked at institutional web pages of a US government institution. And in doing so, for a start, he did a multimodal analysis quite early when such things were not particularly popular for digital media texts. And he came up with this concept of traversal. Now, we talked about transcendence earlier on. This is a similar concept, okay? This is the idea that you're not reading a fixed text, but actually meaning is created by looking at different texts by looking at a text in a dynamic way. So in hypertext, as the web used to be called, you can actually follow links and you can create your own meanings by navigating through a text in a particular order. I think this is useful in understanding the dynamic nature of web texts, of internet texts. And the idea that meaning is created by traveling, by traversing, I think is very important. And again, it moves us away from this understanding of text as something fixed. Okay. The third study is by Ruth Vodak and Scott Wright. And they looked at a discussion forum on the internet, which was set up for people to discuss multilingualism in Europe. And it was an attempt to address this idea of a democratic deficit. So the idea that citizens did not have a chance to take part in politics. And so what do? We set up a website where they get to discuss things. Now, the interesting thing about this is they found that actually nobody read these forums afterwards. No politicians read them. So people had a chance to talk, it was translated into lots of languages, and then nothing happened. So what I like about this is they looked at the text and they looked at the interactions and what was happening, but then they took a step back and said, how does this actually fit into the institutional context? What is happening here politically? So they brought in ideas from politics, etc., to think about this as an institutional practice. And they also made some good points, I think, about how design of this forum affected the communication and what happened afterwards. And then the final study is by Gerlinde Mautner. Now, she is somebody who uses corpus linguistics. Is that something you've come across? All right. Corpus linguistics basically is the use of large bodies of text to study language. And you can do lots of different things with them. You can look at patterns in language. You can look at how grammar is changing over time. You can look at what particular terms are associated with other terms. So there was a large study done on migrants, which looked at newspaper texts, and they looked at all the different ways that newspapers referred to refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, and found that newspapers are horribly racist, not surprisingly. It's not a funny topic, actually, but it's true. So that's corpus linguistics. And what Mautner was interested in is why people in critical discourse studies at the time, in 2005 or a few years before that, were not interested in the web. And I actually found this to be true. So I came to Lancaster in 2003 to do a master's, and then stayed on to do my PhD. And I kept wondering, why aren't people talking about the web? because it was a very important part of my life, and I sort of felt it really shapes how I communicate, but it's not something that people are really talking about. And so she points out some of the problems with working with this kind of data, which I think persist to a certain extent. So for example, the lack of pre-ordering. So if you are looking at something like political speeches, then you can look at all the political speeches of a particular type, let's say US presidential inauguration speeches, going back through history, and they happen at a certain time regularly, and you know roughly how long they're going to be, etc. Whereas on the web, you have this huge mixture of different kinds of texts that are put together in very, what she calls, indiscriminate ways. Partly, I would say that social media has made the web a little bit more organized, in that before the participatory internet, the web was a little bit like the Wild West, with everyone doing their own thing, whereas now people have been sort of funneled into doing things in particular ways. Twitter has a 140-character limit. Facebook allows certain kinds of posts, text, photos, etc., etc. So this has made it a little bit more ordered, which makes it easier for companies to make money off people, because they can be put in certain categories. Okay, so-and-so said they're happy on Facebook today, so I'm going to show them ads for holidays because they're excited and they might book them. So-and-so is sad, so I'm not going to show them ads for, I don't know, arms manufacturers, I don't know, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, Mountain, I think, points out some of these challenges in working with web data. Now, what she said is, it seems fairly safe to predict, therefore, that sooner rather than later, a much larger number of critical discourse analysts than at present will build their corpora from the web as a matter of routine. Now, interestingly, this didn't really happen for about 10 years, and only now is it starting to happen that people take the web as a starting point for their research, and they say, this is important, I'm going to look at this. But even now, it's very common. I get a lot of PhD proposals of people saying, I'm going to look at newspaper reports of this, that, or the other. And I sort of wonder, okay, but what about the comments? What about social media, etc.? So I think it hasn't quite filtered through fully. All right, so those are some earlier studies which you might want to look into to get a grounding. Finally, sorry?
Is that because the corpus banks don't exist?
Yes and no. So on the one hand, it's much easier to get newspaper data, which is based on print editions, than it is to get social media in a corpus. But there are lots of corpora of social media texts, and the web itself can be used as a corpus in many ways. So using both common search tools like Google and more sort of specific search tools, like there's a tool called WebCorp, which allows you to build a corpus on the fly by entering particular search terms. So it is possible. There are, however, some ethical issues as well. So using social media data particularly is quite fraught ethically. And so most corpus linguists just ignore that and use it anyway, which I personally have a bit of a problem with. But it is possible to get social media data for corpora as well as for more qualitative research. All right, so finally then, I'll just very briefly talk about some of the other approaches. I'll spend a couple of minutes on this, and then you can read into these yourselves if you want, and we'll leave 5 minutes at the end for a quick discussion. So corpus linguistic research we've just been talking about, and there's a paper that I wrote with colleagues that came out in 2014, which involved combining critical discourse studies and corpus linguistics to look at activism and the internet, and particularly Twitter, and how activists use Twitter, and what time of day they post things, and what they're worried about, and things like that. The two approaches I think you might find particularly useful are computer-mediated discourse analysis, which is associated with Susan Herring, and discourse-centered online ethnography, which is associated with Yannis Andritsopoulos. Now, very briefly, computer-mediated discourse analysis, like critical discourse studies, is not one method, but more what Susan Herring calls a methodological toolkit and a set of theoretical lenses. Now, what she suggests is that we can actually think about language at different levels, and we can use different tools, methods, to examine it at those different levels. Now, what interests the kind of more traditional linguists are the top 3 levels, particularly the top 2, structure, meaning, and interaction. And there are various approaches that are, I suppose, more linguistic here. Text analysis, semantics, pragmatics, conversation analysis, etc., which allow you to look into things like spelling, formatting conventions, meanings, and at the more sort of interactive level, how people communicate. So how do they take turns when they're speaking? What happens in exchanges? How are topics threaded together, etc. So there are different approaches there that are more linguistic, but at the other end of the scale, you have the more social phenomena, which I think are probably more interesting for you. And these are things like, how does power and influence work? How is identity shaped? How are communities formed? The question we had earlier on, what do you do about cultural differences? And you can use linguistic approaches here, including critical discourse analysis and others, but there's no reason why you can't look at social behavior, looking at ethnography, for example, which is mentioned in the next box, or things like grounded theory, etc. And the other 2 levels, which she added later on, so she started off with those 4, these were added later on, are participation and multimodal communication, all of which I think are also interesting to scholars working in a wide variety of disciplines. Okay, so that's computer-mediated discourse analysis, which, as I said, I think is a very useful approach in this area. The second approach is discourse-centered online ethnography. Now, this involves a combination of not just observation, but also, Andrusopoulos suggests, interviews. I would argue that there's actually other ethnographic approaches you can take too that don't necessarily involve interviews. And this, he draws on work in digital literacies and also other ethnographic approaches, and he's come up with these 2 sets of guidelines. The first is for systematic observation, and so he suggests that you should, first of all, think about relationships and processes rather than what he calls isolated artifacts. So these would be texts, right? Rather than static texts, you think about how these texts came into being and how they relate to other texts. You start with the core and move to the periphery. So this is quite a general idea that you have to start somewhere. So you start with the most important and salient phenomena or texts, and you keep going back to them and seeing how they change over time or in different contexts. Maintain openness. This just means don't come with fixed ideas, but if you observe something that changes your views, let it also change your assumptions and theoretical approach, for example. Use all available technology. So this just means you might think about looking at web forums, but people might interact with them very differently on their mobile devices, for example. So it's worth thinking about that. And then once you've made these insights, then you can take further samples. So this is his guidelines for observation, and then he also has guidelines for contact, because this is the idea that you should interview people who are actually producing or consuming these texts that you're interested in, or these particular processes. And I'll leave those for you to look at. But basically, this really, I think, is quite a detailed methodological approach, which could be quite useful for you if you think about how it applies in your own contexts, your own research contexts. Okay, so that's taken us to discourse-centered online ethnography. I'll just leave you with 4 other works you might want to follow up on. The first, by David Barton and Carmen Lee, which is called Language Online, which is just quite a general overview of how language is used in digital contexts, but very much from a qualitative ethnographic literacies perspective. not, like much of the research, from a more quantitative perspective. So that's interesting. And the same could be said for Philip Sargent and Caroline Tagg's book, which also takes a more qualitative approach. Greg Myers, his book, The Discourse of Blogs and Wikis, I think is very interesting. Although the technology that he's looking at is still around, obviously it, to a certain extent, has receded in importance compared to other forms of social media. And finally, if you want a really more straightforward introduction to researching language in social media, there's a book by Ruth Page, David Barton, Michelle Zappa-Vigna, and myself, which is called Researching Language in Social Media. So if you're kind of struggling with language as something that you want to study, and you don't feel that you have access to it, that might be a good place to start, which will then take you to other places. But in terms of the social media side of it, I'm sure that you certainly supersede the knowledge that's available from that book. All right, so we're left with 5 minutes, and I've got 2 questions for you. And then there are also some tasks there that you might want to think about on your own if you're reflecting on this lecture later on. The first is, what have some of the impacts of social media on learning and teaching been in your professional contexts? And you can think about the different levels there of context. And the second is, can and should we critique social media platforms while still using them extensively? So I'm going to give you just 2 minutes to talk about that with your neighbors. Then we'll finish off with a quick, I know, it's easy to discuss in 2 minutes, right? Then we'll finish off with some general discussion. Okay, I gather there's a break after this, and Don has very kindly allowed me to take just a few minutes of your break, but I think you may well continue discussing this in the break too, I hope. But just for now, any thoughts on these 2 questions that have arisen out of your discussion just now? Yes?
I would say that for a woman to be able to engage in the online world has been revolutionary. So I'm the chair of ALT. I could never have become the chair of ALT if I didn't engage in social media. If I didn't engage online, because I'm in an institution that's a Russell Group institution, my voice wasn't heard at all, but they took notice of me through my external engagement. So now I'm influential because of that. It didn't happen the other way around.
Okay, thanks for sharing that.
The second question, I was potentially going to say when better.
Sorry?
When better.
When better, okay. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I just think you've probably got a lot of impetus and a lot of opportunity, which, applying the principle of retrospective regret, we might in a decade look back and say, what could we have done if only we had thought about it?
Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think looking at social media is a continuation of cultural studies, going back to people like Raymond Williams, who would argue that we should really, treat popular culture as something very important,
yes,
especially as it's so ideological and hegemonic.
Yeah.
So I think absolutely we should be using it, but critiquing it.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
We read an article, 10 Lies of Ethnography. It seems like all those lies can happen in number 2.
Lies?
Yeah, 10, talked about the 10 lies of ethnography.
Yeah. Okay.
About distancing yourself as a researcher from things. So we are so immersed in social media, can we then actually get a critical view? Because
I'd agree with that. I guess what made me ask this question is there's a lot of my contacts on social media, my friends on Facebook, people I follow on Twitter, will often post critically about social media institutions. But of course, by posting this, they're creating content for the same social media institutions, and by reading it, they're making money for those social media institutions. So I guess, wouldn't it be better if you're really critical to completely disengage? But then I say, well, if that's true, then I'm a total hypocrite, so it's difficult.
Can I pose a critique?
Yes.
That there's some criticisms around actually the development of social media tools being a predominantly male, Western-orientated kind of activity. Yes. Silicon Valley, for example, is predominantly the producer of these tools.
Yeah.
and whether subconsciously or not, the design of those tools are built around that kind of male Western dominance. And I wonder if that perhaps influences the kind of content that is then produced inside those spaces.
Yeah. I'd agree with that, absolutely. And thinking about it more geopolitically, there have been initiatives by Facebook, for example, to provide internet access to people in India and in several African countries. And the downside of that is you're kind of within Facebook and you can't get out of Facebook. So they have the internet in theory, but actually it's just Facebook. So you know about that. Absolutely, yeah. And there's other examples like that too. Yeah. If you're thinking about the Facebook movie, then yes, definitely. All right, last point I'll make about that is I do agree with that, but I'd also, now this is something I didn't mention during the lecture. Have you come across this concept of affordances? Yeah, so that's quite a current concept. I think that's quite important when thinking about social media generally, but also it's something that's important when thinking about users of social media and what they do with it and how they find ways of sometimes subverting what the social media platform is for. Now that can have very negative impacts on people's lives as well, but it can also have quite positive impacts when you find that people use social media in all kinds of ways that the companies making them didn't expect. And then, of course, these ways of using them typically become co-opted and the companies find ways of making money off them. But at least there's the potential for development and evolution by users exploiting affordances in unexpected ways. All right, Don.
Okay, thank you, Johnny. I'm now going to make a few, as the chair, I have the privilege, the pleasure of being able to make a few comments. For me, that was fascinating, because for me, there was lots of my thinking, I think, that was coming out, and lots of thoughts that were emerging for me. And at various points, certain things were coming out. So just to share a few of those with you, maybe. I wondered about the definition of social media, and I wondered about something like online chaotic interaction stimulating or subverting order. And I think some of the comments later actually came somewhere near to that. I do think that social media is a particularly interesting area. It's certainly not something that's going to go away. Actually, I'm not a user of Facebook, so you might be able to tell something about me from that. But I do wonder. I wondered how successful Johnny was with this by thinking about the number of you who were using social media during the session. And then I was thinking, well, maybe success would have been not so much to do with how many of you were using it, but how many of you were using it in order to think about critical discourse analysis on those media. So I won't ask for any answers on that, but that was something that it seems to me that social media does have that opportunity of being able of us being able to use it in different ways at different times and for different purposes. So I think that was quite an interesting one. It's interesting. I was actually at the BBC a few weeks ago. I was in New Broadcasting House, and one of the things that was happening there, which I saw, which I think is fascinating, was there are trainers within the BBC in terms of training those who are capturing news. Yeah? So people who capture the news for the BBC are trained within New Broadcasting House. And one of the things that they are now training their new capturers to do is to use their mobile phones to capture news which will be broadcast. A standard mobile phone. And that then opens up, it seems to me, other new possibilities and other ways in which things might work in the future. And actually they are discussing ideas already about what the implications of that are in terms of wider use. So I thought that was fascinating in terms of what you were saying, Johnny, about that. And also to mention, I should also mention that if you do have an interest in this idea of discourse analysis and discourse approaches, actually Johnny is assistant editor of Discourse Approaches to Politics, Society and Culture. So if that's something that I think that you might be interested in having a look at in terms of keeping an eye on what's happening in that area. So can I ask you to thank Johnny for his session this morning?